In every neighborhood, there is always someone who decides that rules matter more than reason, that control is worth more than community, and that appearances are more important than reality. In my neighborhood, that person was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Her title was technically HOA president, but her behavior was far closer to that of a tyrant. She lived only a few houses down from mine, and over the years I had witnessed her escalate from petty complaints to open warfare against anyone who dared resist her vision of perfect suburban order. For years I had stayed clear of her drama. I kept my yard tidy, followed the rules, and minded my own business. But sometimes, even when you play by the book, a Karen will decide that your existence is an offense. For me, that line was crossed over something as simple as a mailbox. My property sat at the very edge of the subdivision, where the HOA's influence met the border of county-maintained land. Long before the HOA was even established, my house had stood on that corner. And long before Karen moved in, a custom-built wooden mailbox with a wrought iron stand had marked the entrance to my driveway. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't against any city ordinance. But in Karen's eyes, it was unacceptable. Why? Because it wasn't one of the approved plastic uniform mailboxes she had forced on the rest of the neighborhood. At first, it was just passive-aggressive notes. Anonymous letters slipped into my door, hinting that my mailbox was unsightly and detracting from property values. Then came the official HOA notices, each one claiming that my mailbox violated community aesthetic standards. I ignored them at first because I knew something Karen did not. The land where that mailbox stood did not belong to the HOA. It sat just outside their jurisdiction, part of a strip of land excluded from their authority when the subdivision was formed. My property line extended further than she assumed, and the deed made that fact undeniable. But Karen was not someone who accepted resistance lightly. Each letter grew more hostile, each threat of fines more exaggerated. She started bringing it up at meetings, telling anyone who would listen that I was ruining the image of the neighborhood. Most neighbors didn't care, but those too afraid to cross her kept silent. Slowly, Karen convinced herself that my mailbox wasn't just a problem. It was a battle she had to win, and like all battles with Karen, it was one she intended to fight dirty. The day it happened was one I'll never forget. I came home from work to find the mailbox gone. The post had been ripped out of the ground, the wood splintered where it once stood. The soil was disturbed. Tire tracks pressed into the grass where someone had parked too close. At first, I thought it was vandalism, maybe some teenagers acting out. But then I noticed the folded note taped to my front door, written in Karen's signature sharp handwriting. It read, "Your mailbox has been removed as it violates HOA standards. A compliant replacement will be required. Failure to install one within 7 days will result in daily fines." That was the moment I realized Karen had crossed the line from petty harassment to outright destruction of private property. She hadn't just filed a complaint or issued a warning. She had taken it upon herself to physically trespass, to tear something down that didn't belong to her, and to flaunt it like she had every right in the world. My first instinct was anger. I could feel it boiling under my skin as I looked at the torn earth where the mailbox had once stood. But after the rage settled, something else took over, cold, calculated resolve. Karen thought she had won, that her authority was absolute. But she had overlooked one thing: paperwork. And paperwork is something Karen could never overpower. That evening, I pulled out my deed, carefully stored in a fireproof box in my office. Page after page confirmed what I already knew. My property extended several feet beyond where the HOA boundary ended. The mailbox sat squarely within that protected area, completely outside the HOA's control. Karen hadn't just overstepped, she had committed trespass, theft, and property destruction. The law was not on her side, and I now had the proof to strike back. But before I made my move, I wanted to prepare. I documented everything: photos of the damage, copies of every HOA letter, screenshots of Karen's emails, even witness statements from neighbors who had seen her standing by my driveway earlier, that day with a smug expression. I knew Karen's pattern. She would deny everything, twist the story, and try to rally the HOA against me. If I wanted to win, I needed to build a case so solid that even she couldn't worm her way out. As I pieced it all together, I started thinking about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a mailbox. It was about power. Karen believed she could do whatever she wanted, no matter how unlawful, simply because most people were too afraid or too tired to resist her. My mailbox had just become the spark that would test how far she could go and how far I was willing to push back. That night, as I stood in the quiet of my yard looking at the empty patch of dirt, I knew this fight was inevitable. Karen had declared war, but she didn't realize I had already set the battlefield. The deed was my weapon. The law was my shield, and Karen was about to learn the hard way that stealing a mailbox was more than just petty HOA business. It was the mistake that would unravel her entire empire of control. The next morning, I made my decision. I wasn't just going to replace the mailbox. I was going to turn it into the symbol of everything Karen could not take away. The deed would back me, the law would protect me, and the community, those tired of her tyranny, would finally have a reason to stand behind me. Karen thought she had buried me by ripping that mailbox out of the ground. What she didn't realize was that she had just planted the seed of her own downfall. And as the sun rose over the neighborhood, I knew Chapter 2 of this battle was about to begin. The morning after, Karen tore out my mailbox. I woke with a clarity that only comes when anger has cooled into strategy. The ground outside my driveway still bore the scars of her arrogance. Splintered wood gouged earth, and tire marks pressed deep into the soil. It was no longer a mailbox issue. It was a test of ownership, a battle over who truly held authority in the neighborhood. Karen thought her title as HOA president gave her power over me, but she had forgotten that titles mean nothing when they stand against the weight of the law. I laid everything out on my kitchen table, the deed to my property, the subdivision's original plat maps, every HOA notice I had received, and photographs from the day before. Piece by piece, I assembled them like a war chest. The deed, with its crisp language and stamped seals, was my greatest weapon. It clearly marked the property line extending beyond where Karen assumed it ended. My mailbox had always stood on that land. The HOA had no claim, no jurisdiction, and absolutely no right to touch it. As I studied the documents, I couldn't help but think about how many neighbors had fallen victim to Karen's intimidation. She thrived on fear. She sent letters, imposed fines, and embarrassed people at meetings until they submitted. Most gave in simply to keep the peace, believing it was easier to comply than to fight. But my situation was different. I had leverage she couldn't erase, and I intended to use it. Still, I knew Karen. She wouldn't admit wrongdoing. She would deny removing the mailbox, blame community volunteers, or invent rules on the spot to justify her actions. That was her playbook. Twist the truth until it sounded like law. If I wanted to beat her, I needed evidence she couldn't dismiss. So I walked the property again, camera in hand, capturing every detail. The torn soil, the tire marks, the angle where the mailbox had once stood. I even found a small piece of broken wood wedged in the grass, splintered with fresh marks. It was enough to prove the destruction had been recent. Then came the witnesses. A neighbor across the street mentioned, casually, that he'd seen Karen and another board member standing near my driveway the afternoon before. They were laughing, watching something being hauled into the back of Karen's SUV. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but in hindsight, the description matched perfectly. That detail was crucial. Not only had Karen trespassed, but she had likely transported my mailbox herself. With all this in hand, I printed copies of the deed and the plat map, highlighting the boundary line. I placed them in a folder, along with the photographs and a written summary of events. This wasn't just preparation for a conversation. It was preparation for escalation, whether that meant presenting it to the HOA, the county, or even the police. But first, I decided to give Karen the chance to reveal herself. I attended the next HOA meeting, knowing she would bring up my mailbox in front of the board. Sure enough, midway through the agenda, Karen's voice sharpened as she shifted the discussion. She announced that a non-compliant mailbox had been removed from the neighborhood, declaring it a victory for community standards. She painted it as if she had saved property values single-handedly, framing me as a defiant homeowner unwilling to follow rules. Some neighbors nodded politely, unwilling to challenge her, but I could sense the tension. A few glanced at me, waiting to see if I would respond. I didn't speak, not yet. Instead, I let her boast, let her dig herself deeper. When she finished, I quietly slid the folder onto the table and opened it. One by one, I laid out the documents for the board to see. The deed, the plat map, the photographs of the damage. My voice was calm, but the weight behind my words cut through the room. The mailbox had stood on my land. The HOA had no jurisdiction. Karen had trespassed, destroyed private property, and stolen something that was never hers to take. The silence that followed was heavier than her gavel. Board members leaned forward, their faces shifting from polite neutrality to concern. A few exchanged nervous glances, realizing they might be implicated by association. Karen's smile faltered, her practiced confidence slipping for the first time. She tried to dismiss it, claiming the HOA acted within its rights, but the documents said otherwise. My property was mine alone, backed by county records, not subject to HOA interference. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stated the facts, then closed the folder. The board had seen enough. The meeting moved on, but the energy had shifted. Karen's control over the room was fractured. For the first time, her authority had been questioned publicly, and the evidence wasn't in her favor. After the meeting, whispers spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some were shocked Karen had acted so brazenly. Others were quietly thrilled to see someone stand up to her. The HOA had long operated like a shadow government, but now people realized its power wasn't absolute. That night, as I walked back to my house, I felt the weight of momentum shifting. Karen had crossed the line, and now everyone knew it. But I also understood her nature. She wouldn't back down gracefully. She would retaliate, twist the narrative, and double down on her, crusade against me. The deed had silenced her temporarily, but it hadn't defeated her. The question was not whether she would strike again, it was how. And as I looked at the empty space where my mailbox once stood, I knew this fight was far from over. Karen had stolen a piece of wood and iron, but in doing so, she had handed me something far more powerful. The chance to dismantle her empire one fact at a time. The deed was out. The truth was on my side. And now, the battle was about to escalate beyond anything Karen had anticipated. When a person like Karen feels cornered, they don't retreat. They lash out. The HOA meeting had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. The calm unveiling of my deed, the undeniable evidence, and the silent acknowledgement from the board had punctured her. Carefully constructed image of control. For years, Karen thrived on the perception that she was untouchable, that her word was law. But now that facade had cracked, and she needed to reassert dominance before others sensed her weakness. It didn't take long for her retaliation to begin. The first wave came in the form of violation notices. Within a week, my mailbox wasn't the only issue Karen discovered on my property. According to her sudden flurry of letters, my lawn was improperly edged, my trash bins were visible from the street, and even the color of my shutters was non-compliant with community aesthetics. Each letter threatened escalating fines, each one dripping with Karen's need to reestablish control. But I knew better. These weren't legitimate violations. They were weapons. And just like before, the law was on my side. I responded to each notice with precision, citing county ordinances and HOA bylaws, attaching photographs that contradicted her claims. Every time she tried to trap me with paperwork, I buried her in facts. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about forcing her to drown in her own tactics. The second wave was more insidious. Karen began whispering to neighbors, painting me as a troublemaker who wanted to undermine the community. She claimed I was plotting to sue the HOA, that I wanted to dismantle everything they had built. I could see her campaign at work. Neighbors who once waved now looked hesitant, their smiles thinner, their words shorter. It was the classic Karen strategy. Isolate, alienate, and divide. But here, too, she underestimated me. While she spun stories, I quietly spoke with the people who mattered most, the ones tired of her tyranny. Slowly, I discovered I wasn't alone. Others had suffered under her reign. A family fined for a playset in their backyard. An elderly couple harassed for keeping potted plants near their porch. Even a veteran threatened with fines. For flying his flag, too, prominently. Each had stories. Each had resentment, but none had the proof or the willpower to challenge her. Now, with my deed as the rallying point, I offered them something Karen never could, a chance to push back. Quietly, a network began forming. Neighbors who once suffered in silence started sharing their letters, their frustrations, their doubts about Karen's authority. It was as if the mailbox incident had opened a floodgate, and all the bottled-up anger against Karen was rushing to the surface. The third wave of retaliation was the most dramatic. One morning, I awoke to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my front door. Final warning, non-compliant property. It was signed in Karen's handwriting, though no official HOA stamp or board approval accompanied it. This wasn't procedure, it was personal. A final warning for what exactly? The mailbox that had been stolen? The imaginary violations she had invented? It didn't matter. The intent was clear. She wanted to break me down to remind me that she still had power. But what Karen didn't realize was that every desperate move she made only strengthened my case. The more baseless notices she issued, the more erratic she appeared. The more she slandered me, the more allies I gained among the neighbors she had wronged. And the final warning sticker? That was the moment she exposed herself not as a leader, but as a bully acting without authority. I documented everything. Photos of the sticker, copies of her letters, testimonies from neighbors about her harassment campaigns. Piece by piece, I was building something far stronger than a defense. I was building the foundation for a counterattack. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder, mistaking my silence for weakness. She showed up uninvited near my property, standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard, jotting notes as if surveilling me. On one occasion, I caught her peering over the edge of my driveway, as though she were daring me to confront her. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I let her actions accumulate, each one another stone in the wall closing in on her. The turning point came when Karen made the mistake of overstepping not just with me, but with others. A neighbor 2 streets over, who had watched my battle quietly from the sidelines, came forward one evening. Karen had trespassed on his property, photographing his backyard without permission, claiming his fence was too tall. He was furious but unsure how to act. When I showed him the folder of evidence I had collected against her, his anger turned into determination. Soon after, others joined in, each with their own stories. What Karen failed to see was that by targeting me so aggressively, she had exposed her methods to the entire community. Her retaliation wasn't proof of strength, it was proof of fear. And fear, once revealed, spreads faster than authority. By the end of that month, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. The once loyal board members began distancing themselves, quietly admitting they hadn't authorized Karen's actions. Even those who disliked me couldn't deny the pattern of abuse now coming to light. Karen was no longer the unquestioned leader. She was becoming a liability. Through it all, I remained patient. My strategy was not to outshout her or to match her aggression. My strategy was to let her dig her own grave, one desperate act at a time, while I prepared the final blow. The stolen mailbox had started the war. The deed had given me my shield. But Karen's retaliation was giving me something far more valuable than proof of ownership. It was giving me proof of her corruption. And with each passing day, she was sealing her own fate. As I looked again at the scarred patch of earth where my old mailbox once stood, I no longer felt anger. I felt anticipation. Karen thought retaliation was her weapon, but she didn't realize it was actually mine. Because retaliation leaves a trail, and soon that trail would lead straight to her downfall. Karen had always relied on silence to keep her power intact. Neighbors might grumble behind closed doors, but when the HOA gavel fell, few dared to oppose her. For years, she thrived on that silence, mistaking it for respect. But silence only lasts until someone shows that resistance is possible. My stolen mailbox had become that spark, and slowly, I could feel the neighborhood beginning to shift. It started subtly. People who once looked away when Karen patrolled the streets with her, clipboard began making eye contact with me. Some even gave me quiet nods of encouragement. The kind you give someone fighting a battle you're too afraid to join. At first, it was just whispers, comments at the mailbox cluster, brief exchanges during morning walks. But those whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Every resident had a story. A mother fined for letting her child's bike rest against the garage door. A family forced to repaint their shutters because the shade of blue wasn't in harmony with the neighborhood palette. An elderly man scolded for leaving a potted cactus on his porch because it clashed with the aesthetic. Each tale carried the same theme: Karen's obsession with control, her eagerness to punish, and her delight in turning trivial matters into battles. One evening, I invited a few of these neighbors over, not to rally them openly, but to share experiences. Over coffee at my kitchen table, documents were passed, letters compared, and frustrations aired. What struck me most was not the anger, but the exhaustion. People weren't just upset with Karen, they were weary of living under constant surveillance, afraid of being targeted next. I laid out my folder of evidence. The deed, the photographs, the harassment notices, even the bright orange final warning sticker Karen had slapped on my door. Their eyes widened as they realized my case was airtight. For the first time, they saw not just resistance, but the possibility of victory. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, my house became the quiet gathering place for those who wanted change. Each new story added weight to the growing pile of grievances against Karen. The more we compared notes, the clearer the pattern became. Karen wasn't just overzealous, she was abusing her role, twisting HOA authority into a personal weapon. Meanwhile, Karen sensed the shift, but misunderstood its cause. Instead of reflecting, she doubled down. Her patrols became more frequent, her violation notices more absurd. She sent letters accusing residents of unauthorized lawn decorations and improperly stored holiday wreaths. She fined one neighbor for leaving their car in the driveway overnight. Even though the bylaws permitted it, every act of control was meant to scare people back into silence. But instead, it had the opposite effect. It fueled the fire. The board, once her loyal chorus, began to fracture. At meetings, some members hesitated to support her rulings, quietly excusing themselves from her crusades. Others began asking questions, uncomfortable with how far she had gone. When I presented yet another violation, notice against me, this time accusing me of having grass longer than regulation length. When my lawn had been freshly mowed, several board members openly shifted in their seats, their faces betraying unease. Karen was no longer a strong leader in their eyes. She was becoming reckless. The turning point came during a Saturday afternoon gathering at the community park. What was meant to be a cheerful neighborhood picnic became the stage for Karen's unraveling. She had marched through the event with her clipboard, scolding children for leaving toys on the grass and chastising families for setting up chairs too close to the walking path. Normally, people would mutter but comply. This time, however, something different happened. A father, tired of her constant interference, quietly asked me about my deed in front of others. I explained calmly that Karen had overstepped her authority by ripping out my mailbox, and that the law, not the HOA, had the final say. The conversation grew, neighbors circling closer, listening as I laid out the boundaries of HOA power versus property rights. For the first time, people realized they had options, that Karen's threats weren't the unbreakable laws she claimed them to be. Karen saw the crowd, heard the murmurs, and panicked. She stormed over, clipboard in hand, and tried to shut it down, declaring that I was spreading false information. But her outburst backfired. The more she barked, the more obvious her desperation became. Instead of silencing the group, she exposed herself as the very bully I had described. By the end of the picnic, the whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were conversations, open and defiant. From that day on, the neighborhood changed. Where once people submitted to Karen's rules, they began questioning them. Where once her notices inspired fear, now they inspired ridicule. Neighbors compared violation letters like trading cards, laughing at the absurdity of her claims. Some even began ignoring her notices entirely, confident that she couldn't enforce them without the board's backing. Karen, of course, noticed her slipping grip. She grew more paranoid, more aggressive, and more isolated. Board meetings that used to run smoothly, under her iron control, now dissolved into arguments, with members openly challenging her authority. When she tried to fine me yet again, this time for allegedly blocking the view with a flower bed, another board member finally spoke up, reminding her that landscaping within property boundaries was not subject to HOA approval. That single moment cracked her facade further, and the room buzzed with murmurs of dissent. The neighborhood had turned. What began as a solitary battle over a mailbox had evolved into something much larger, a collective awakening. Karen's power had always depended on fear, but now that fear was gone, All that remained was her desperation, flailing in the face of a community no longer willing to bow. Yet even as the tide shifted, I knew the war wasn't over. Karen was cornered, and cornered people can be dangerous. She had lost the obedience of the neighborhood, but she still clung to her title, her clipboard, and the illusion of authority. The next move she made would be her boldest yet, and if history had taught me anything, it would not be subtle. As I watched the community shed its silence, I realized we had reached a tipping point. The neighbors were ready. The board was wavering. Karen was cracking. The question now wasn't whether she would fall. It was how hard. And I had every intention of making sure the fall was permanent. When soft power failed, the law took center stage. Weeks of harassment, fabricated violations, and petty theft had created a record so clear it could not be ignored. The deed that had once been a private reassurance became the cornerstone of something much larger, a legal strike aimed precisely at the heart of Karen's unchecked authority. Gathering evidence and solidarity had been one thing. Converting that into action that would force accountability was another. It was time to make the fight official. The first step was filing formal complaints. The county clerk's office received copies of the deed, the subdivision plat, photographs of the torn ground and splintered mailbox, and a detailed timeline of Karen's behavior. Alongside these were the collected violation notices she had issued, each one annotated and cross-referenced. Witness statements were signed and notarized. Neighbors who had seen Karen with the mailbox, those who had received absurd fines, and those who had endured her late-night patrols with clipboards like torches. The paperwork filled a folder thicker than any HOA pamphlet, and every page was a rebuke to the idea that her title afforded her impunity. The county's response was procedural but decisive. An investigator visited the property, took independent photographs, and compared them with the public records. For the HOA, which had long hidden behind vague rules and selective enforcement, the scrutiny was uncomfortable. The investigator's report noted several red flags: unauthorized removal of private property, lack of board approval for the alleged enforcement actions, and potential misuse of HOA resources for personal vendettas. The tone in those sterile sentences was damning. Once the complaint reached the HOA's insurance carrier and legal counsel, the quiet maneuvering began. Suddenly, board members, who had once nodded along with Karen's proclamations, were receiving stern memos from counsel, advising restraint and recommending independent reviews of enforcement procedures. The legal machinery didn't need dramatics. It only needed facts, contracts, and precedent. And the facts in our folder were unequivocal. The next logical step was mediation. Legal counsel for the HOA proposed a meeting to resolve disputes. It was a thinly veiled attempt to manage public perception and limit exposure, but it provided a valuable platform. In that formal setting, the dossier I had compiled was presented not as an accusation shouted over coffee, but as a documented complaint backed by county records, photos, and sworn statements. The presence of legal representatives changed the tone of the room. No longer could Karen wave her clipboard like a scepter and expect immediate obedience. The mediators' neutral questions and the HOA counsel's requests for clarification exposed gaps in the HOA's claimed procedures that Karen had repeatedly ignored. Under legal pressure, cracks widened in the board's resolve. Members who had once been complicit in her methods now faced exposure and potential liability. A reasonable person could see the calculus. Protect the HOA's reputation and financial stability by distancing from an overzealous president. The board's public posture shifted from defensive to conciliatory, but legal counsel's notes suggested deeper consequences might follow unless restitution and policy reforms were implemented swiftly. Restitution discussions turned toward replacing the mailbox and compensating for the damage. It would have been a small victory if the matter had ended there, but the legal tide had begun to sweep out more than just the physical remnants of the mailbox. When the HOA's counsel requested a full review of enforcement records, the trail led to more troubling discoveries, authorizations that were never documented, fines levied without board votes, and evidence of selective enforcement that disproportionately targeted the same small group of dissenters Karen had kept an eye on for years. As pressure increased, Karen's reaction followed the same pattern as before: escalation. Feeling raw and betrayed, she attempted to weaponize the legal system herself. A flurry of documents showed up, alleging defamation and slander against her reputation. The countersuit was clumsy and full of holes, seeming more like a panic move than a considered legal strategy. Legal counsel for the HOA, and eventually the investigator, flagged inconsistencies and questioned the timing. When a person tries to claim damage to reputation while simultaneously being found to have acted without authority, the benefit of the doubt dissolves fast. The local sheriff's office was brought into the conversation when the matter edged from civil infraction to potential criminal trespass. The evidence of unauthorized removal of private property and physical trespass were concrete enough to prompt a preliminary inquiry. Deputies visited, cataloged the damage independently, and took statements. The neutrality of the sheriff's department reduced the room for subjective interpretation. In their reports, the sequence of events was described plainly. A mailbox existed. It was removed without authorization. Property lines demonstrated ownership. Witnesses described individuals associated with the HOA in proximity to the removal. Those sentences, dry and official, began to carry the weight of legal consequence. Even as legal wheels turned, the neighborhood felt the shift. Conversations at block parties and backyard gatherings were no longer about petty grievances, but about accountability. People who had previously hidden their discomfort with Karen's tactics were now emboldened to come forward. The ledger of grievances grew. A pattern emerged. Every heavy-handed enforcement action traced back to the same ethos of control, and every control move had a trail of paperwork or witness testimony that contradicted it. The HOA's insurance carrier, watching potential liability mount, urged comprehensive remedial action. They recommended an independent audit of enforcement procedures, transparent documentation of fines and approvals, and mandatory training for board members. The insurer's involvement was a cold, administrative blow to Karen's brand of governance. Insurance companies operate on risk assessment, not loyalty to local drama. Their advisories forced the board to consider not just expedient fixes, but structural changes that would prevent arbitrary enforcement in the future. Pressure mounted and options narrowed for Karen. Legal counsel advised the board to implement immediate safeguards, suspension of unilateral enforcement actions, a review of all fines issued in the past 3 years, and a public statement promising reforms. The board, caught between public scrutiny and fiduciary responsibility, began to distance itself from the president's most aggressive maneuvers. Isolation replaced applause. Allies who had once attended HOA events with her now watched from sidelines and declined to be seen in close association. Even so, Karen's desperation made her unpredictable. She attempted a final dramatic gambit, a last-ditch attempt to rally support by painting the entire scenario as an external attack on the community. She framed legal scrutiny as overreach, spun the narrative of victimhood, and made one last round of personal appeals to neighbors. But the community had changed. People who had once followed her for fear now seen the facts in black and white, photos, deeds, official reports. Her narrative could no longer mask the reality the paperwork had revealed. By the time the mediation wrapped, terms had been proposed that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Formal apologies to affected homeowners, reimbursement for damages, a review and rollback of improperly levied fines, and the formation of an oversight committee to prevent unilateral action. There was even talk of a recall vote, a mechanism rarely used but now discussed openly as a responsible avenue for preserving the HOA's integrity. As legal proceedings progressed, the mailbox, once a small wooden mark post in the ground, had become a symbol, not merely of a personal affront, but of a system that had permitted overreach and the abuse of power. The papers that had sat in my fireproof box were no longer private proof. They had become instruments of accountability, tools that turned suspicion into sanction. Karen's options were narrowing and her influence was dwindling. The legal strike had not yet delivered a knockout, but it had undermined the foundation of her authority. The law's impartiality, backed by photographs, deeds, and sworn testimony, changed the dynamics in a way no amount of clipboard wielding could reverse. The next chapter would not be decided in boardrooms or quiet mediation tables alone. It would be fought in a public forum where community voices mattered, where evidence would be aired openly, and where the future of the HOA's leadership would be determined, not by fear or habit, but by the will of the residents themselves. The courtroom smelled of old wood, polish, and paper. It was a space where the posturing of clipboards and the whispered intimidation of late night HOA patrols meant nothing. Here, power rested not in titles, but in documents, precedents, and sworn testimony. For Karen, who had spent years crafting an aura of invincibility, it was the most unforgiving stage imaginable. The case was a civil action, structured around property damage, trespass, and the misuse of HOA authority. At its center was the deed, a simple piece of paper that proved the land. Beneath the removed mailbox was mine alone. Around it, a mountain of supporting evidence had been built, photographs of the destruction, sworn statements from neighbors, county investigator reports, and even the sheriff's summary of events. Each document, small on its own, formed a mosaic that painted Karen's actions in undeniable detail. The opening statements from both sides could not have been more different. The HOA's counsel attempted to downplay the situation as a misunderstanding, a technical oversight concerning property, lines and standards enforcement. They spoke of rules, consistency, and maintaining the neighborhood's image. My attorney countered with precision. Private property had been destroyed without consent, authority had been abused, and attempts had been made to intimidate residents into compliance. It was not about standards. It was about control, and about the violation of rights clearly established in law. The testimony phase cut deepest. Neighbors who had once whispered about Karen's behavior now took the stand, their words steady under oath. One recounted the night Karen had boasted about taking care of that mailbox problem. Another described years of harassment over lawn decorations and seasonal flags. A third produced a letter from Karen, unsigned but clearly written in her style, threatening daily fines for a flower bed that did not meet aesthetic expectations. Each testimony stacked higher the picture of a president who had allowed her personal vendettas to bleed into official action. When it came time for the county investigator to speak, the courtroom quieted. Their words were stripped of emotion, but their neutrality was devastating. They confirmed the property line, verified that the mailbox had been located outside HOA jurisdiction, and documented that its removal had been unilateral. The sheriff's report was entered into record as well, noting trespass and potential criminal violations. Karen's aura of authority shrank under the stark light of procedure. Her defense grew more frantic as the evidence piled up. Attempts were made to claim that the mailbox was a safety hazard, or that complaints from anonymous residents had forced action. But cross-examination revealed the absence of board votes, of records, of any official mandate beyond Karen's personal say-so. What she had framed as governance was, in fact, vigilantism under the banner of the HOA. The judge, maintaining composure, asked precise questions about authorization, jurisdiction, and documentation. Each answer cut deeper into Karen's narrative. The deed, presented once more, lay at the center of the table like an immovable weight. Every time it was referenced, the room shifted. It was the single, irrefutable piece of proof that demolished the pretense of authority Karen had tried to wield. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the outcome was clear. The HOA's counsel requested leniency, portraying the entire ordeal as an unfortunate lapse rather than malicious overreach. My side demanded accountability, not only for the mailbox, but for the pattern of abuse it represented. Restitution, reimbursement of legal fees, and injunctive relief to prevent further harassment were placed firmly on the table. The ruling was deliberate and precise. Karen, acting in her capacity as HOA president, had exceeded her authority and trespassed on private property. The HOA was held liable for damages, and Karen's personal involvement opened the door for additional penalties. Restitution was ordered, reimbursement of costs approved, and an injunction issued preventing the HOA from enforcing rules on property not under its jurisdiction. The ruling also compelled the HOA to conduct a transparent review of all enforcement actions within the past 5 years. But the courtroom's decision carried weight beyond the pages of the judgment. In the neighborhood, the verdict reverberated like thunder. Residents who had once feared the clipboard now saw it as a hollow prop. Karen's power, built on intimidation and selective rule enforcement, crumbled under the scrutiny of law. The ruling emboldened those who had been silent for too long, and whispers of a recall vote became a chorus. The recall meeting was tense but decisive. Residents gathered in the community hall, papers in hand, faces set with determination. When the ballots were counted, the result was overwhelming. Karen was removed from her position as president. Stripped of the power she had abused for so long, her legacy was reduced not to the rules she claimed to uphold, but to the abuses she had committed in their name. The HOA, chastened by the ordeal, began its reforms. A new board was elected, one more interested in cooperation than domination. Transparency became policy, not afterthought. Residents who had once hidden behind hedges to avoid confrontation now attended meetings openly, their voices finally heard without fear of reprisal. As for the mailbox, it was rebuilt, sturdier than before, planted firmly in the soil proven by deed. To passers-by, it was an ordinary fixture. But for those who had lived through the drama, it was a monument to the victory of fact over bluster, of law over intimidation, of quiet resilience over loud control. Karen's name faded from the minutes of meetings, her influence reduced to a cautionary tale. But the lesson lingered. Power, unchecked, can grow arrogant, and sometimes it takes a single, ordinary object, a wooden mailbox, anchored by the permanence of a deed, to bring that arrogance crashing down. The story ended not in shouting matches or threats scrawled on notices, but in the calm authority of a judgment that could not be ignored. Justice had been served, and with it, peace returned to a neighborhood that had once been ruled by fear. And so, what began with a stolen mailbox ended in the courtroom where truth prevailed, and the tyranny of a single clipboard-wielding president was struck down for good. And that, my friends, is how one furious HOA president learned the hard way that a clipboard and a bad attitude don't stand a chance against cold, hard facts. She thought she could bully, intimidate, and rewrite the rules as she pleased. She thought tearing out a mailbox would be the final word. But what she forgot is simple. Paper speaks louder than power plays. The deed, the proof of ownership, ended her reign faster than any angry letter ever could. This story isn't just about a mailbox. It's about what happens when people stand up to bullies hiding behind titles. For years, Karen used fear to control her neighbors. But the moment one person refused to back down, the whole community realized they didn't have to live under her shadow anymore. The silence was broken. And once people started speaking out, the clipboard lost its bite. Think about it. How many times have we seen rules twisted into weapons, all for the sake of control? How many times have people been pushed around because they thought they had no choice? This case proves there is always a choice. Sometimes all it takes is one bold step, one document or one stand to shift the balance. And for Karen? Well, her story is a warning. Power that isn't grounded in fairness will always collapse. You can only push people so far before the pushback comes. And when it does, it's unstoppable. So next time someone waves authority in your face, remember this story. Remember the neighbors who turned whispers into action. Remember the homeowner who held his ground. And most importantly, remember the mailbox that brought down the mighty clipboard queen. Because in the end, justice isn't loud. It doesn't scream or threaten. Justice stands calm, just like that homeowner, holding the deed in his hands, letting the truth do the talking. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more wild tales of HOA drama, entitled Karens and Property Disputes Gone Wrong. Every week we dive into real battles between ordinary people and the petty tyrants who think they run the world. Hit that bell icon so you never miss the next showdown, and trust me, the stories coming up are even more explosive. Until next time, stay strong, stay sharp, and never let a Karen steal your mailbox.